for us, this story started with interest on my part and specialism. So put your hand up if you know what the archive is? Good few hands. Going back to the pitching thing, the archive is a great place to look for stories where no one else is looking for them. They're not press released. And the reason I got this DeepMind story in the very first place is because I studied astrophysics, and there's lots of astrophysics papers in the archive, so I knew what it was. When I decided to become a journalist, I naturally started looking there for other stories, and my first job was as a technology reporter on a little B2B magazine called Information Age. So I was always looking at the archive. And what happened starting in about 2011, 2012 is that research papers by Google and Facebook started just appearing on the archive with no PR. They were just, that's gold. That doesn't happen much. That is absolute gold. So I have been paying attention to this thing for quite a long time, and that meant that I'd been writing about AI, which is what those research papers were about, for about 4 or 5 years now. And in doing that reporting, when you write about something over and over again, you start to understand more broadly what the questions are. You start to understand what matters. And what I had come to understand writing about AI is that what matters is who controls the data that the artificial intelligence is trained on. What does that data, what's in that data set, how big is it, what people are in there, that's the fulcrum of the powerfulness of artificial intelligence. And so in February 2016, DeepMind announced that they were doing this new project called Streams with the Royal Free Hospital Trust in London. And that's 3 different hospitals wrapped up under a trust. A big group of hospitals with about 1.6 million people coming through every year. And when I saw this, my first thought was, well, that's cool. I wonder what data they're using to do that. It must be pretty sensitive. In the press releases, they mentioned, we've got the highest standards of data security, blah, 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 but they didn't talk about it at all. And one of the things you learn is that AI companies don't like to talk about the data that they use because they pretty much just like to get it for free from their users. That's a different discussion. But anyway, I immediately FOIA'd this data sharing agreement, which was even mentioned in the press release. There was no magic about it. They said we've got the high standards of everything and we've got all the right agreements in place. So I said, okay, well, can I please see those agreements, Royal Free Hospital? And one of the realizations, which I guess is just a practical investigative point, is that you should always be looking for surface area to public bodies. So especially if you want to report about companies, you can't FOIA DeepMind. You can't FOIA Google or Facebook. They'll just, it's not a thing. But there is a law that says that all public organizations must send you documents that you ask for, or correspondence, or anything, actually. It's quite broad, with certain conditions. So I did this, and the documents finally came through. There was no problem. I was on a plane to America at the time. I was reading them on the plane. I was like, oh, this document, I don't get it. It's not, I don't understand it. Who knows if there's a story there? Oh, well, FOIA is just phishing anyway. Like, there's probably not very much. And I went off and did my reporting in California, and when I came back to London, I was like, right, let me just take a quick look at this, and started calling up people I knew in AI and in data protection, and saying, like, what does this mean? And it gradually became clear that this was actually quite a big deal, and that what this document showed was that DeepMind, which is an AI company that was bought by Google in 2014, 15, had been given, the number wasn't in the document, but it had been given an entire trust's worth of identifiable patient data. What that means is that it's not anonymized, no personal information is scrubbed. So it's like Mary Smith, age 57, address here, had HIV when she was 40, has had 2 abortions. All of that was given to Google with no redactions, nothing. And it also became clear during the reporting that it had been given to them, this contract that I'd got, this data sharing agreement, was incredibly thin. Normally when you hand over that amount of data, it can take years. But this had been whipped up in about a month. And it was the wrong kind of agreement. I never verified it, but it looked, an amazing source found that it looked like it had been pasted together from 2 different agreements from 2 different institutions connected to UCL. I was never able to verify that, but pretty sure that's true. That's probably slander. Oh well. And so we ended up with a story which said that Google had been handed all of this data to build Streams, and it was a pretty big story at the time. And it took a while for it to like catch on, but 4 days later, the Daily Mail put it on the front page with the headline, "Google handed patients files." And that just went, that was insane. That's the most insane time of my life as a reporter, is having the phone and my inbox go bananas after a Daily Mail front page. It kind of makes me think it's the only thing that actually matters in journalism, is if you can get on the front page of the Daily Mail. The story doesn't matter. Like, no one actually read the words. It's just like the message, Google did bad. That's all that matters. And all that time, that was kind of the first stage, was just translating the document, figuring out what it meant, and saying, this is what it means, here's what's happened. And then that's when, it's almost when the real investigation began, because that's when I started looking into, like, well, was this illegal? Like, have they broken the law?
What made you even suspect that? You just like,
well, my sources said this is screwed, basically, and more, not just one, but like everyone I talked to, I've probably talked to, 40 data protection experts overall in different ways for this story, and every single one of them was like, yeah, this is screwy, like this is not right, and so you kind of, you get a sense. I didn't know, looking at it when I got it, that this was illegal. And we actually, just on Monday, the Information Commissioner's Office, which is the regulator for data protection law in the UK, has said that it was an illegal deal. So it's quite nice to be vindicated, even if it is 14 months later. But that's just how fast that regulator moves. But so the investigation then started, and Will talk more about this, but that's when kind of the practicalities of how do you run an investigation that takes 2 months of pretty much solid time. Well, a month of my time solid, but 2 months overall from the time I started asking the questions. How do you do that at a magazine like New Scientist, where we're putting out a magazine every single week? It's hard work. Like, by the time I had finished reporting the second story and we finally got that online, everyone was sick of it. I was like, come on, Hal, get back to work. Like, we've been covering for you for weeks now, and it's not fair. So how to deal with that, I don't know. But the second investigation, it asked, what were the laws that could have validated this transfer of data? Like, how could this have been legal? Like, what possible mechanisms are there? And then you find out, then you ask the people who look after those mechanisms, and it turns out that they haven't been gone through. So there's a thing called Section 251, which allows for identifiable data to be transferred without any consent of the patients. And there was no consent in this. It was just the hospital giving it all to Google. And it turns out that there's actually quite a lot of records kept by these regulators. You never hear about them. You never know about them. But you can find these things out. And the story ended up, it was super long. It was super boring. I distinctly remember Jules, one of the sub-editors, coming up to me and going, this is so boring, Hal, God almighty. And she's kind of right, because it's very different to what Josh is talking about with features. In a way, you're not really doing an investigative story. I mean, sometimes you can, but sometimes you can't. Sometimes you've just got to put the facts together in a structure that stands up to criticism and analysis and is true. And that is not commensurate. That does not go hand in hand with telling a lovely flowing narrative, as I'm sure you know. That's probably a good point to hand over to you. I mean, we can do some back.
Yeah, I'm sure. But so did we do introductions? Yeah, so neither of us are at New Scientist anymore, so we can say what we like. So at the time, like a year ago, how was the lead tech reporter? I was the technology editor, so we're working together on this. But the fact that there were two stories is sort of important from sort of the internals point of view. I mean, most people, you probably don't know and don't really care, because at the moment there's just the DeepMind investigation. But the first story that Hal got from that FOIA, working out that basically this meant that Google had access to 1.6 million sort of pieces of patient information. It was a big scoop. The magazine was really happy about it. It was our lead story. Did really, really well in terms of readers online. And the national newspapers picked it up in the following weeks. So, thumbs up all around, big pat on the back. And then a few weeks later, everyone else got back to business. A few weeks later, I actually got a call on a Friday night from Hal saying, hang on, I've been talking to my sources a bit more, and there's something really dodgy here. Not only does Google be given all this information, but they seem to have done it in a way that sort of skirted or broken the rules. So we decided that Monday we talked to the senior editors at New Scientist again, really excited. We went in at that point and said, this is massive. Forget the first story. This is really explosive. We actually have we think at least that there's something really not okay with this. And they we were sort of so great, yeah. And the senior editor sort of looked at us, puzzled, and said, I don't get it. Isn't that the same story like that we've already done? What's different? So that first story, especially the way it was then spun by a lot of the newspapers, the fact that Google had been given this information, everyone just assumed, yeah, obviously it was done in a dodgy way. So the fact that we were now coming like, it was done in a dodgy way, was a surprisingly hard sell. I mean, they just didn't get it. But once we sort of explained on board that that what we were alleging this time was a much bigger deal. Then of course Hal was given free rein to do it, and most of his time was put onto that. And you have to realise that New Scientist has got a pretty small news team. I had to run a technology section which had sort of 6, 7 really good technology stories we needed each week, with 2 full-time reporters and a handful of freelancers if you're lucky each week. And here was Hal, basically going to be off doing this investigation for a month. So although we had backing, the longer it went on, you felt the pressure. I mean, even like every now and again, I'd turn and say, "Hal, I have to have another story." So you'd have come out of your.
I think
whole...
I did one in the middle.
Yeah.
I think I had to do one for you in the middle.
You've always been lent on like that. So that's the sort of reality. So yeah, these things take time, but we kind of made time for you to do it, but it wasn't time we really wanted to give. Anyway, all of which is to say that as this thing dragged out, and it took a lot longer, this second story, because of what we were suggesting, or what we wanted to suggest, that we really, really needed to know that we got it right. It's one thing, like a bunch of sources telling you that it's not okay, but some of those sources themselves, like sort of campaigners in this area, so you can't just take them on trust. So Hal had to completely understand the legalese and all the documents, the sort of the regulations surrounding healthcare, and none of this was his background. So this took a lot of time. Then, of course, once we had the story put together, again, it was going to be a big sort of lead story in the magazine. And this is another thing which really tied us down. So with a print magazine, as well as all the online stuff that New Scientist does, has a weekly schedule. So the story had to be ready in time for that weekly print run. And this time, because of what we were suggesting, we had to have the lawyers look at it. And they really sort of cleaned out all of the sort of even something that smelled sort of sensational, even though we'd approached it pretty straight. So that's why the final story ended up being really dull. I mean, you have to just say it as straight and as plainly as you can. But when we got to the press deadline for that week, there was still some concerns from the legal people, and I think. At this point, we'd gone to DeepMind and say, this is what we're going to publish. You have a right to know about it, and can you comment? And they really hit us with a massive email of sort of line by line,
17 pages.
17 pages of line by line, basically saying this is wrong. You've misunderstood this. This is absolute nonsense. This comes in sort of before our print deadline, so we had to pull the story.
I think we had the story online at that point.
So we had the story online.
Yeah.
So we pulled it off of online because we didn't have the time to then go through addresses and and cover ourselves. We put it off online. There was a big hole in the magazine which we had to fill with some pretty pictures, and then next week comes along, and then we're sort of back to the beginning again. Like you were sort of going through all these points, and at this stage, the senior editors are also sort of on us, like saying you've got to really prove that you're right about this. So you went through point by point all the things that they were saying and why you were still right, and you and I went through the reasoning time and time again, and I'd be pulled into meetings again that you went at, and they'd be on me saying, "Are we really sure about this?" And I was saying, "Kind of, but I trust Hal." Finally, we got to the point where we had an even more sort of scrub clean story, which is weaker than we'd originally wanted to say, and what we still believe now, especially with the vindication that we could have said at the time. Again, the legal people went through it, and we didn't even bother with the magazine this time around. We published it online, and that was that. And then not that many people took much notice of it. Yeah. So the first story with the big headline, Google has all this patient data. Yeah, that sort of fits with this general narrative. NHS patient data, we're really precious about that, especially in this country with the NHS, and Google is the big boogeyman of tech giants and stuff like that. So that resonated. The second story, which kind of sounded a bit like the first story anyway, and the allegations and because it was so dry and all this stuff, it didn't make the splash at all that the first one did. we even sort of got in touch with some editors at other places, like I think the Guardian, even that had jumped on the first story and said you may be interested in this. And I think because what we were alleging was sensitive stuff. People don't jump on it on the same way. They're like, okay, you're going to go out there and say that, then that's cool, but we'll wait and see what
what the ICO says on Monday.
So that's where that came to. All of that is to say that then, from the magazine's, from New Scientist's point of view, was it worth it? We had like our main tech reporter out for basically a month. The first story I said did well, and reputation-wise, I got in lots of papers. But I'd be interested, so I mean, now obviously you all know about the DeepMind NHS story, but how many people here actually knew that came from New Scientist? It was New Scientist that wrote the story. So not many. So
not too bad.
Yeah, not too bad. I mean, it's kind of what I was expecting, because everyone else was on it, and it's been talked about by so many other people since. But from the magazine's point of view, from the senior editor's point of view, was that worth it? What does the magazine get out of it? I mean, like Josh was saying earlier, it's a product. We're selling a magazine. Where we need people to pick this up from the newsstands and buy subscriptions. So we don't get any of that from it. We get a bit of good reputation from insider reputation, and reputation the first time round from the sort of the national newspaper coverage, but none of that at all for the big investigation that Hal did. I mean, maybe a bit more now that we've come sort of 14 months later, and now you were right, and people are sort of mentioning it again. So I had the editor-in-chief saying, are we really sure about this? Do we even really want to run it? They were also worried about the New Scientist's position on artificial intelligence and technology. I mean, we're certainly not sort of champions of it, but in terms of AI and technology really can change the world for good, and healthcare is somewhere that they really can make a difference. So there's to then sort of be sort of pedantic and say, well, they didn't do it in a fair way, they didn't get the right regulatory documents. The editor-in-chief saying, is this really sort of a New Scientist story? So we had that, and we had to sort of defend it along those times. Would we do it again? I honestly don't think the magazine would do the same kind of story again, knowing what they think, which is really, really sad. I mean, not just because Hal's not there anymore, and they maybe don't have the sort of the expertise in this area, but in terms of was it worth it for that particular publication, I'm really not sure. Which is a sad note to end on, but